The golden light of sunset painted long shadows across Kennewick, Wyoming, as Lucas Porter stared at the untouched coffee growing cold before him. 10 years to the day since he'd buried Mary, and the hole in his heart felt just as raw as it had when he'd first thrown dirt onto her pine box. He ran a weathered thumb across the simple gold band he still wore, wondering for the 1,000th time why he hadn't followed her to the grave. "Pa." His son Caleb's voice broke through his reverie. At 19, the boy was nearly a man now, with Mary's gentle eyes and his stubborn jaw. "You're doing it again." Lucas cleared his throat. "Doing what?" Staring at nothing, thinking about her. Caleb slid into the chair opposite him, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "It's been 10 years. "I know exactly how long it's been," Lucas replied, more sharply than he intended. He softened his tone. "I'm fine, son. Just tired is all." The Dusty Creek Saloon hummed with the usual evening crowd, ranchers and cowboys spending their hard-earned wages on whiskey and cards. Lucas owned the place, had bought it 5 years after Mary passed, needing something to occupy his hands and mind. It didn't help much with the latter. "Mr. Danielson's asking about that shipment of bourbon," Caleb said, clearly trying to pull his father back to the present. Lucas nodded. "Tell him it'll be here by week's end." He made to rise, but his son's hand on his wrist stopped him. "Why don't you head home? I can close up tonight." Lucas wanted to argue but found he lacked the energy. "Maybe I will at that." The walk home was short, just 3 blocks from the saloon to the modest 2-story house he'd built for Mary when they'd first arrived in Kennewick in '68. 23 years ago now. They'd been so young then, full of dreams about the life they'd make together on the frontier. He paused at the white picket fence she'd insisted on, running his fingers along the weathered wood. It needed painting again. Mary would have nagged him about it until he'd given in. Without her voice to push him, small things like that fell by the wayside. Lucas didn't bother lighting lamps when he entered the house. He knew every inch by feel and memory. He sank into his chair by the cold fireplace and closed his eyes, letting the familiar ache of loneliness wash over him like an old friend. Morning came as it always did, whether he welcomed it or not. He rose, splashed water on his face, and dressed for the day. The routine was unchanging: breakfast at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, then to the saloon to inventory supplies and handle the books before opening at noon. "Morning, Mr. Porter," Mrs. Holloway chirped as he took his usual table by the window. "Coffee's fresh." "Obliged," he murmured, accepting the steaming cup. "Got a new boarder coming in today," she continued, filling his cup. "Woman traveling from back east somewhere. Letter said she's looking to set up some kind of business." Lucas grunted noncommittally. Kennewick had grown considerably over the past decade, with the railroad bringing new faces almost weekly. Most didn't interest him. After a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits, Lucas made his way to the saloon. Caleb was already there, sweeping the floor before they opened. "You should have slept in," Lucas told him. "You closed late," Caleb shrugged. "Couldn't sleep much anyway, got a letter from Sarah yesterday." Lucas felt a pang of guilt. Sarah was his daughter, 2 years older than Caleb, living in Denver now with her husband. "What's she say?" "She's expecting. Due in January." Lucas stopped midway through counting bottles of rye. "A baby." His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "I'm going to be a grandfather," Caleb grinned, the first genuine smile Lucas had seen on his face in weeks. "Seems that way." Lucas felt something stir in his chest, not happiness exactly, but a distant cousin to it. He nodded, unsure what to say. The day passed in its usual fashion, the saloon gradually filling as afternoon turned to evening. Lucas was behind the bar, mechanically pouring drinks and making change, when the batwing doors swung open and a woman stepped inside. The saloon didn't fall silent like in dime novels. Most patrons barely glanced up, but Lucas found his eyes drawn to her, perhaps because she moved with such purpose, or perhaps because she was striking in a way that demanded notice without seeming to seek it. She was tall for a woman, dressed practically in a dark blue traveling suit that had seen better days. Her auburn hair was pinned up beneath a modest hat, and she carried herself with the straight-backed confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, even in unfamiliar surroundings. She approached the bar, removed her gloves, and met his gaze directly. Her eyes were green, intelligent, with fine lines at the corners that spoke of both laughter and hardship. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "I'm looking for the proprietor." "You found him," Lucas replied. "Lucas Porter." She extended her hand, a gesture more commonly exchanged between men. "Violet Graves, Mrs. Holloway said you might be hiring." Lucas frowned, automatically taking her hand before realizing what he was doing. Her grip was firm but brief. "Hiring for what, exactly?" "Bartending, serving, bookkeeping. I'm adaptable." She glanced around the saloon with a critical eye. "And judging by your ledger there, you could use someone with a head for numbers." Lucas followed her gaze to the open book on the bar, its pages filled with his messy scrawl. "You can read upside down, when necessary." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "I also noticed your whiskey bottles are arranged by price rather than type, which is inefficient, and your barback seems overwhelmed." She nodded toward young Tommy Wilson, who was indeed struggling to keep up with washing glasses. Lucas stared at her. "You've been in here all of 2 minutes." "I observe quickly. It's a useful skill." She removed her hat, revealing more of that rich auburn hair. "I need work, Mr. Porter. Mrs. Holloway says you're fair and honest, which is all I ask in an employer." "I don't recall saying I need help. You didn't have to." That almost smile again. "Your son mentioned it to Mrs. Holloway this morning, said his father works too hard and needs competent assistance." Lucas made a mental note to have words with Caleb. "Did he now? He seems concerned about you." Her expression softened slightly. "I promise I won't intrude on family matters." "I simply need employment, and you apparently need help." Lucas studied her. She was clearly educated, probably in her mid-30s, and carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with someone seeking work in a frontier saloon. "What brings you to Kennewick, Mrs. Graves?" "It's Miss," she corrected, "and I came because it's far from where I was before." The simplicity of her answer struck him. He knew something about wanting distance from the past. "Can you start tomorrow?" he heard himself ask, surprising them both. She blinked, then nodded. "What time?" "Noon." "We'll see how it goes." "Thank you, Mr. Porter." She put her hat back on, adjusting it carefully. "I won't disappoint you." As she turned to leave, Lucas found himself oddly reluctant to see her go. "Miss Graves," he called after her, "if you don't mind my asking, what were you before?" She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. "A teacher," she said, "among other things." With that cryptic response, she was gone, leaving Lucas with the strange feeling that something in his carefully ordered existence had just shifted, like the first tremor before a landslide. The next morning, Lucas found himself taking extra care with his appearance, trimming his beard and putting on a clean shirt before heading to Mrs. Holloway's for breakfast. He told himself it was simply professional courtesy for a new employee, nothing more. Mrs. Holloway greeted him with knowing eyes. "Miss Graves is already gone for the day," she said without preamble. "Up at dawn, that one. Said she wanted to familiarize herself with the town." "I didn't ask," Lucas pointed out, taking his usual seat. "Didn't have to." Mrs. Holloway poured his coffee. "She's a fine woman, though carrying some sadness. I can tell." Lucas grunted, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Many folks are sad about something. Indeed they are." She patted his shoulder with motherly affection. "Some just wear it more openly than others." When Lucas arrived at the saloon, he was surprised to find Violet already there, engaged in animated conversation with Caleb. She'd changed into a simple blouse and dark skirt, practical for working behind a bar. Her hair was braided and pinned up neatly, showing off a graceful neck and the clean lines of her profile. "Morning, Pa," Caleb called, looking more cheerful than usual. "Miss Graves was just telling me about Chicago." "Is that where you're from?" Lucas asked, hanging his hat on the rack by the door. "Originally from Boston," Violet replied, "but I taught in Chicago for several years." "Miss Graves knows Latin," Caleb said with something like awe. A largely useless skill in Wyoming, Violet said dryly, but old habits die hard. I've been reorganizing your supply shelves, Mr. Porter. I hope you don't mind. Lucas moved behind the bar to find the bottles arranged by type and region, labels facing forward, everything meticulously ordered. You did all this morning? I rise early. She handed him a sheet of paper. I've also taken inventory and made a list of what needs restocking. Lucas scanned the neat columns of figures. Her handwriting was small and precise, her calculations accurate. You didn't have to do this before your first official day. I prefer to be useful. She hesitated, then added, and busy minds have less time for wandering. Something in her tone made him look up sharply. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Lucas felt a flicker of recognition not of her face but of the quiet pain she carried. She knew about grief. He was certain of it. The moment passed. Violet continued with her work, explaining her organizational system as she went. Lucas found himself impressed by her efficiency and practical intelligence. By the time they opened at noon, the bar was better arranged than it had been in years. The regular customers noticed the changes immediately. Several commented on the improved service and cleaner glassware. Violet moved through the room with easy grace, memorizing orders and names, handling the rowdier patrons with a firm but pleasant demeanor that somehow managed to discourage troublemaking without causing offense. Where'd you find her? Sheriff Tate asked Lucas late in the afternoon, watching as Violet deftly settled a brewing argument between two ranch hands. She found us, Lucas replied. Lucky for you, the sheriff observed. She's got a way about her. Lucas couldn't disagree. By closing time, Violet had proven herself more valuable than he could have hoped. She counted out the day's earnings with swift accuracy, balanced the ledger, and even suggested changes to their ordering system that would save money in the long run. You've done this before, Lucas said as they locked up. Worked in a saloon, I mean. Violet shrugged, pinning her hat back in place. I've had various occupations. A woman on her own learns to be adaptable. No family back east, a shadow crossed her face. None living. Lucas nodded, understanding all too well. You did good work today. The position is yours permanently if you want it. Thank you. Her smile was small but genuine. I believe I do. As they parted ways outside the saloon, Lucas felt strangely reluctant to end the evening. Can I walk you back to the boarding house? Streets can be rough this time of night. I appreciate the concern, but I'm quite capable of looking after myself. She reached into her pocket and partially revealed a small derringer. I've had practice. Lucas raised his eyebrows. School teaching must be more dangerous than I realized. To his surprise, Violet laughed a warm, rich sound that seemed to brighten the dim street. Oh, Mr. Porter, you have no idea. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and something about the sound of it stayed with him long after he'd returned to his empty house. Days turned into weeks, and Violet's presence at the dusty creek became as natural as the sunrise. She transformed the saloon with small but significant changes: fresh wildflowers on the tables, cleaner windows that let in more light, a small lending library in one corner for those who could read. Surprisingly, many of the regular customers took advantage of the books, sitting in quiet contemplation between hands of poker. Never figured Hank Wilson for a reading man, Lucas remarked one afternoon, watching the burly blacksmith absorbed in a dog-eared copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. People can surprise you if given the opportunity, Violet replied, refilling a customer's coffee. Mr. Wilson was telling me about his mother who taught him to read before she passed. I think he enjoys reconnecting with that memory. Lucas studied her profile as she worked. You have a gift for getting folks to open up. I listen, she glanced at him. People rarely get enough of that. It was true, Lucas reflected. He'd spent so many years locked in his own grief that he'd stopped truly listening to those around him, even his own children. Watching Violet interact with the townspeople made him realize how much he'd withdrawn from the community that had once embraced him and Mary. As summer deepened into fall, Lucas found himself looking forward to each day at the saloon in a way he hadn't in years. He told himself it was the improved business, the way Violet had helped organize everything so efficiently. But in truth, it was her company he anticipated, their quiet conversations in the early mornings as they prepared to open, her insightful observations about the customers, even their occasional good-natured disagreements about how certain aspects of the business should be run. One September evening, after a particularly profitable day, Lucas surprised himself by asking, "Would you like to stay for a drink? After closing, I mean." Violet looked up from wiping down the bar, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "That would be nice." They sat at a corner table, the saloon strange and quiet without its usual crowd. Lucas poured them each a small measure of his best bourbon reserved for special occasions. "To good business," he said, raising his glass. Violet tipped hers in acknowledgement. "And to new beginnings." The bourbon burned pleasantly going down. Lucas watched as Violet sipped hers, appreciating the amber liquid with evident knowledge. "You know your spirits," he observed. "My father was something of a connoisseur." A shadow passed over her face, quickly masked. Though his appreciation eventually became excessive. Lucas nodded, understanding the unspoken. "Mary never cared for drinking, said one of us had to keep a clear head." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife to Violet. The name slipped out naturally, surprising him. "Your wife?" Violet asked gently. Lucas nodded, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. "She passed 10 years ago. Fever took her and our youngest." "I'm sorry," Violet said, her voice soft with genuine empathy. "Children should outlive their parents. Emma was just 5. The words felt rusty, unused. He rarely spoke of Emma, even to Caleb and Sarah. She had Mary's laugh. Violet reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of such simple comfort that Lucas felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "I lost my husband and son in a fire," she said quietly. 8 years ago now." Lucas looked up, meeting her eyes. There it was, that recognition he'd sensed from the beginning. "I'm sorry," he said inadequately. "As am I." She took another sip of bourbon. "Daniel was a good man. Our boy Henry was 7. Some days the missing is considerable." The simple truth of her words struck Lucas more deeply than any elaborate expression of sympathy ever had. "Considerable," he echoed. "That's as good a word for it as any." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the shared understanding between them more comforting than any words could be. "After," Violet finally said, "I couldn't bear to stay in Chicago. Every street, every shop reminded me of them. I taught in various towns, never staying long. Eventually, I realized I was running from memories instead of learning to live with them." "And that's what brought you to Kennewick?" Lucas asked. She smiled faintly. "That, and a rather persistent former student who became a journalist. He wrote a rather unflattering piece about a local businessman who had political ambitions and a taste for harassing female teachers." Lucas raised his eyebrows. "You were forced to leave." "Let's say it was strongly suggested that my continued presence would be problematic." Her expression hardened slightly. "I chose not to make things easy for certain parties by disappearing quietly, which resulted in some rather public accusations. False ones, naturally." "Naturally," Lucas agreed, beginning to understand why she'd traveled so far. "Their loss is Kennewick's gain." Violet looked surprised, then pleased by his comment. "That's a kind thing to say." "Not kind, true." Lucas refilled their glasses. "You've brought life back to this place." "The saloon was doing fine before I arrived." "I wasn't talking about the saloon." The words slipped out before he could consider them. Their eyes met across the table, and Lucas felt something shift between them, a deepening of the connection they'd been building over the past weeks, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither had been ready to consider. Violet broke the moment, glancing at the clock on the wall. "It's getting late. I should let you get home to Caleb. He's staying at the Miller Ranch tonight, helping with a sick horse." Lucas stood as she did. "Let me walk you back to Mrs. Holloway's." This time she accepted. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, stars brilliant in the clear Wyoming sky. They walked in comfortable silence, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks. When they reached the boarding house, Violet paused at the steps. "Thank you for the drink," she said, "and the conversation." "My pleasure." Lucas hesitated, then added, "Perhaps we could do it again sometime." "I'd like that." Her smile in the moonlight did something strange to his heart, a fluttering sensation he'd almost forgotten was possible. He watched until she was safely inside, then turned toward home, his step lighter than it had been in years. The following weeks brought subtle changes to their relationship. Nothing overt, nothing that would raise eyebrows in town, but Lucas found himself sharing more meals with Violet, lingering after closing for conversation, occasionally walking together on her days off. They discovered shared interests, a love of reading, a dry sense of humor, an appreciation for the stark beauty of the Wyoming landscape. Violet convinced Lucas to join her on a Sunday picnic by the creek that gave the saloon its name, bringing along a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, from which she read aloud, her voice giving new life to the familiar verses. "You miss teaching," Lucas observed as she closed the book. Violet trailed her fingers in the cool water. Parts of it, opening young minds to new ideas, watching them discover their own capacities. She smiled. "But I don't miss the school board meetings or the endless battle for adequate supplies." "You could teach here," he suggested. "Kennewick's growing. The school could use someone with your experience. Perhaps someday." She looked at him thoughtfully. "For now, I'm content where I am." Lucas felt an unexpected warmth at her words. "I'm glad to hear it." October brought the first frost and news that Sarah's pregnancy was progressing well. Lucas found himself looking forward to becoming a grandfather with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He even began crafting a cradle in his spare time, working by lamplight in the evenings. "That's beautiful work," Violet said one evening when she stopped by to drop off some papers and found him sanding the curved headboard. "Mary's father taught me," Lucas explained, running his hand over the smooth pine. "Made one for each of our children." "Sarah will treasure it," Violet said softly. "Would you like to help?" The invitation came spontaneously. "I could use a steady hand with the decorative carving." Violet's face lit up. "I'd be honored." Working together on the cradle became a regular evening ritual. Their heads bent close over the wood as Lucas guided her hands in the traditional patterns his father-in-law had taught him. These quiet hours in his home brought a domestic intimacy that neither of them acknowledged directly but both clearly cherished. One evening, as Violet was preparing to leave, she paused by Mary's portrait in the parlor. It had been painted in their first year of marriage, capturing Mary's youth and the quiet joy that had been her most defining characteristic. "She was beautiful," Violet said. "Yes," Lucas agreed, coming to stand beside her. "Inside and out. You must miss her terribly?" "Every day." Lucas studied the familiar face in the portrait, but differently now than before. Violet turned to look at him. "How do you mean?" Lucas considered his words carefully. "For years, the missing was sharp, like a physical pain that never eased. I went through each day feeling only half alive." He met Violet's gaze. "Lately, I've found myself remembering the good more than the loss, feeling grateful for what we had rather than only bitter about what was taken." "That's a gift," Violet said quietly, "to carry love without being crushed by its weight." "I think," Lucas said slowly, "it helps to have someone who understands the nature of that burden." Their eyes held, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been growing between them hanging in the air. Violet's cheeks flushed slightly and she looked away first. "It's getting late," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. Lucas walked her to the door. "Good night, Violet." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She paused on the threshold, looking back at him with an expression that made his heart quicken. "Good night, Lucas," she replied softly, before stepping into the autumn night. As November descended on Kennewick, bringing with it the first snowfall and preparations for the approaching holidays, Lucas found himself facing the annual dread of Thanksgiving and Christmas without Mary. Each year, these celebrations served as painful reminders of her absence, days when her empty chair at the table seemed to mock all attempts at festivity. This year, however, felt different. When Caleb suggested they host a proper Thanksgiving dinner, Lucas found himself agreeing rather than deflecting. "I could ask Miss Graves to join us," Caleb added casually, though his knowing glance suggested nothing casual about the invitation. "If you think she'd like to come," Lucas replied, attempting and failing at nonchalance. "Pa," Caleb said with exasperated affection, "everyone in town can see how you two look at each other. Even Tommy Wilson commented on it, and that boy barely notices anything that isn't a horse." Lucas felt his face warm. "It's not, we're just friends," Caleb supplied, smiling now. "Sure, Pa, whatever you say." The truth was, Lucas wasn't entirely sure what he and Violet were to each other. Their relationship had evolved into something precious but undefined more than friendship, yet carefully maintaining certain boundaries. They had shared confidences, laughter, and the deep understanding that comes from similar losses, but neither had yet given voice to the changing nature of their feelings. When Caleb extended the Thanksgiving invitation, Violet accepted with genuine pleasure. "I'd be honored to join your family," she told Lucas later, as they worked side by side behind the bar. "Though I should warn you, my cooking skills are limited to what can be prepared over a schoolroom fireplace." "Caleb does most of the cooking anyway," Lucas admitted. "Got his mother's touch in the kitchen, thankfully." "And what did you inherit from Mary?" Violet asked, her tone gently curious. Lucas considered this. "Not much, I'm afraid. She was the one with all the gifts: patience, kindness, faith in people." He smiled ruefully. "I was always the practical one, focused on building and providing. She brought the light." "I think you underestimate yourself," Violet said, surprising him. "I see great kindness in you, Lucas. And patience, too, especially with the young men who come in here looking for trouble but really just needing guidance." Her observation startled him. He'd never thought of his occasional stern talks with rowdy cowboys as particularly kind or patient. "You see things in me I don't recognize," he said quietly. "Perhaps because you've spent too long looking at what you've lost rather than what remains." She touched his arm briefly, the contact warm even through his shirt sleeve. "There's still plenty of light in you, Lucas Porter. It just needed time to find its way back." Thanksgiving Day arrived bright and cold, sunlight glinting off fresh snow. Lucas spent the morning helping Caleb prepare the house and meal, feeling a strange nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. He found himself fussing over details that wouldn't have concerned him a year ago: the arrangement of the table, the polish on the silver that had gone unused for so long, the fresh pine boughs Caleb had gathered to decorate the mantel. "Pa, you're driving me crazy," Caleb finally declared, laughing as he shooed Lucas from the kitchen. "Go chop more wood or something. She won't arrive for hours yet." Lucas grumbled but complied, spending the next hour splitting logs with more vigor than necessary, trying to work off his inexplicable anxiety. It wasn't as if Violet hadn't been in his home before they'd spent many evenings working on the cradle, which now sat finished and waiting to be sent to Sarah. But something about today felt different, significant in a way he couldn't articulate. When Violet arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, Lucas's breath caught at the sight of her. She wore a deep green dress he hadn't seen before, her auburn hair arranged in a softer style than her usual practical braid. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth and wore a smile that transformed her typically reserved features. "Happy Thanksgiving," she greeted them, stepping inside as Lucas held the door. "I brought apple pie. Mrs. Holloway helped, so it should be edible." "It smells wonderful," Caleb said, taking the basket. "Please come in out of the cold." The afternoon unfolded with a warmth Lucas had forgotten holidays could hold. Caleb had outdone himself with the meal: a roast turkey with all the trimmings, fresh bread, and vegetables they'd preserved from the summer garden. Violet fit seamlessly into their small family gathering, drawing Caleb out about his veterinary aspirations and sharing amusing stories from her teaching days. To absent friends and family, Caleb proposed as they raised glasses of cider, his young face solemn for a moment. May they know they are remembered with love. And to new beginnings, Violet added softly, her eyes meeting Lucas's across the table. After dinner, as Caleb busied himself with clearing the dishes, Lucas found himself alone with Violet in the parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. "Thank you for including me today," Violet said, standing by the mantel. "It's been a long time since I've felt part of a family holiday." "Thank you for coming," Lucas replied. "It's been good to see this house filled with laughter again." She turned to face him fully. "You've been smiling more, these past months." "Have I?" But he knew she was right. "I suppose I've had reason to." Violet took a step toward him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "Lucas," the front door burst open, cutting off whatever she had been about to say. Sheriff Tate stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "Lucas, sorry to interrupt your holiday, but we've got trouble. Rivers rising fast with the early snow melt up north. Flood warnings been issued. We need all able-bodied men to help with sandbagging before it breaches the banks and hits the lower town." Lucas was already reaching for his coat. "How bad could be the worst since '76? That tributary creek of yours is already overflowing." Violet was immediately practical. "What can I do to help? Women and children are gathering at the church," Sheriff Tate replied. "Mayor's wife is organizing supplies and shelter for those who might be displaced." "I'll go there at once," Violet said, already fastening her cloak. Lucas caught her arm gently. "Be careful," her hand covered his briefly. "You as well." The next 12 hours were a blur of frantic activity. Lucas and Caleb worked alongside the other men of Kennewick, piling sandbags along the riverbank in the desperate hope of containing the swollen waters. The temperature dropped as night fell, turning the relentless rain to sleet that soaked through clothing and numbed hands. Near midnight, a section of the makeshift barrier gave way, sending water rushing toward the lower part of town where many of the newer buildings stood, including the saloon. "We can't hold it," someone shouted above the roar of the water. "Everyone fall back to higher ground." Sheriff Tate ordered. "Get to the church." Lucas hesitated, thinking of the saloon and all the work they'd put into it. Caleb grabbed his arm. "Pa, we have to go. The whole bank's about to collapse." As if to emphasize his words, a tremendous cracking sound split the night as a large cottonwood tree, its roots undermined by the flood, toppled into the raging river. The men retreated to the church on the hill, where most of the town had already gathered. Lucas scanned the crowded room anxiously until he spotted Violet distributing blankets to shivering children. Relief washed over him at the sight of her safe and whole. She looked up as if sensing his presence, her face lighting with similar relief. She hurried to him, stopping just short of an embrace. "You're soaked through," she scolded, immediately wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "Caleb, you two, come by the stove before you catch your deaths." The night stretched endlessly as they waited out the storm, the church filled with the murmurs of worried families and the occasional crying child. Violet moved tirelessly among the townspeople, offering comfort and practical assistance wherever needed. Lucas watched her with growing admiration, seeing in her actions the same quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. As dawn broke, the rain finally ceased. The men ventured out to assess the damage. The river had receded somewhat, leaving behind a trail of mud and debris. The lower town had suffered significant flooding, with several structures damaged or destroyed. The Dusty Creek Saloon stood waterlogged but intact, its stone foundation having withstood the worst of the flood. The interior, however, was a mess of mud and ruined furnishings. "Could have been worse," Lucas said, surveying the damage with Caleb and Violet. Water had risen nearly 3 feet inside the building, destroying the lower shelves of liquor, ruining the piano, and turning the carefully polished floors into a muddy swamp. "It can be rebuilt," Violet said firmly. All of it, her certainty gave Lucas strength. "Yes," he agreed. "It can." The next weeks were consumed with cleanup and rebuilding efforts throughout Kennewick. The community pulled together, with families taking in those whose homes had been damaged beyond immediate repair. Lucas and Caleb worked from dawn to dusk restoring the saloon, aided by many of their regular customers who volunteered their labor in exchange for the promise of free drinks when the establishment reopened. Violet proved invaluable during this time, organizing work crews, keeping meticulous accounts of what needed replacing, and somehow managing to salvage many items others would have discarded as ruined. "Where did you learn to restore water-damaged books?" Lucas asked one evening, watching her carefully separating sodden pages and hanging them to dry. "My husband was a bookbinder," she replied, not looking up from her task. "I learned a great deal from him." It was one of the few times she'd mentioned Daniel directly, and Lucas recognized the offering for what it was: another piece of herself shared, another wall lowered between them. "He taught you well," Lucas said simply. December brought renewed cold and the gradual restoration of normalcy to Kennewick. The saloon reopened 2 weeks before Christmas, celebrated by a town gathering that felt more like a family reunion than a business event. Lucas found himself genuinely enjoying the festivities, moved by the community's support and by the quiet pride in Violet's eyes as she watched the townspeople fill the space they had worked so hard to restore. Late that night, after the last customer had departed and Caleb had gone home, Lucas poured 2 glasses of the finest brandy that had survived the flood. "To resurrection," he proposed, handing one to Violet. "To persistence," she countered with a smile, clinking her glass against his. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the saloon peaceful around them. "I received a letter from Sarah today," Lucas said eventually. "She and James want to name their baby Mary if it's a girl." "That's lovely," Violet said softly. "Would that please you?" "It would." Lucas turned his glass in his hands. Time was when hearing that name spoken aloud was like a knife to the heart. Now, it feels right, like her memory should continue in a new life. Violet nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's how healing works, I think. Not forgetting, but finding ways to carry the past without being crushed by it." "You've helped me with that," Lucas said, meeting her gaze directly. "More than I can say." "We've helped each other." She set her glass down carefully. "Lucas, I need to tell you something. I've been offered a teaching position." His heart sank. "You're leaving. The offer is here in Kennewick." She smiled at his evident relief. "With the town growing, they're expanding the school after the new year. They need someone with experience to take the older students." "That's wonderful news," Lucas said sincerely. "You'd be an excellent teacher for them." "I haven't given my answer yet," Violet said. "I wanted to discuss it with you first." "With me? Why?" She held his gaze steadily. "Because whatever decision I make affects more than just my professional life now. At least, I hope it does." The meaning behind her words hung in the air between them. Lucas felt his heart beating faster as he realized they had reached a crossroads neither could ignore any longer. "Violet," he began, then paused, gathering his thoughts. "These past months you've brought something back to my life that I thought was gone forever, not just laughter or companionship, but purpose, hope. You've done the same for me," she said quietly. "I came to Kennewick running from the past I wasn't looking for what I found here." Lucas reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm not the man I was when Mary was alive. That version of me died with her in many ways. But the man I am now, the man you've helped me become again, he cares deeply for you." "And I for you," Violet replied, her voice steady despite the emotion shining in her eyes. "More than I thought possible." "So what does that mean for us?" Lucas asked. "It means," Violet said slowly, "that I'd like to accept the teaching position and see where this path leads us." Lucas's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'd like that too." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Violet smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her face. "Then it's settled," she said. "I'll tell the school board tomorrow." Lucas felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a lightness he'd forgotten could exist. "I should walk you home, it's late." "Yes," she agreed, rising. "Though I admit I'm reluctant for this evening to end." "There will be others," Lucas said, helping her with her coat. "Many others, I hope." As they stepped outside into the crisp December night, snow began to fall, large, lazy flakes that drifted down in the lamplight. Violet turned her face upward, catching snowflakes on her cheeks and eyelashes. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Yes," Lucas agreed, though he wasn't looking at the snow. Violet caught his gaze and blushed slightly. Then, with a deliberateness that left no room for misinterpretation, she stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest. "Lucas," she said softly, "I think it's time you kissed me, don't you?" The directness of her statement startled a laugh from him, a genuine, joyful sound that felt like a release of years of tension. "Yes, madam," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I believe you're right." He leaned down as she tilted her face up, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle yet charged with all the feelings that had been building between them. Her arms slid around his neck as he drew her closer, the warmth of her body against his, a stark contrast to the cold night air. When they finally parted, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by emotions he'd thought long buried. "I wasn't looking for this," he whispered. "For you." "The best gifts are often the ones we don't think to ask for," Violet replied, her breath warm against his face. They walked to Mrs. Holloway's hand in hand, reluctant to part, but both aware of the propriety required in a small town. At the door, Violet kissed him once more, briefly but with a promise that left Lucas grinning like a much younger man as he walked home through the falling snow. Christmas that year was a celebration unlike any the Porter household had seen in a decade. Lucas and Caleb invited Violet for Christmas Eve dinner, and she arrived bearing gifts wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. For Caleb, a fine leather-bound journal for his veterinary notes. For Lucas, a first edition of Thoreau's Walden she'd located through a bookseller in Denver. "This must have cost a fortune," Lucas protested, running his fingers reverently over the embossed cover. "Consider it an investment in our future discussions," Violet replied with a smile. "I have strong opinions about Thoreau you may need to be prepared for." Lucas had spent weeks crafting his gift for her, a writing desk of polished oak with delicate inlay work along the edges. Violet's eyes filled with tears when he unveiled it. "It's exquisite," she whispered, tracing the pattern with gentle fingers. "For your lesson plans and correspondence," Lucas explained. "I thought when you start teaching. It's perfect." She embraced him, unconcerned with Caleb's knowing smile. "Truly perfect." Later, as they sat before the fire, Caleb surprised them both by producing a small box from his pocket. "This was Mother's," he said, handing it to Lucas. "Sarah and I talked, we think it's time." Lucas opened the box with trembling fingers to reveal Mary's engagement ring, a simple gold band set with a small diamond. He looked up at his son, a question in his eyes. "She would want you to be happy, Pa," Caleb said quietly. "You've mourned long enough." Lucas closed the box carefully. "Thank you, son. This means more than you know." The moment felt significant, a blessing from his children for whatever future he and Violet might build together. When he walked her home later that night, Lucas felt a newfound peace settling over him, not the absence of grief, but its transformation into something that could coexist with new joy. New Year's Eve brought the entire town together for a celebration at the newly restored church hall. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the festivities as townspeople danced to music provided by a small local band. Lucas, who hadn't danced since Mary's passing, found himself leading Violet onto the floor without hesitation. "I may step on your toes," he warned as his hand settled at her waist. "It's been a while." "I'll risk it," she replied, her eyes bright with happiness. They moved together surprisingly well, finding a natural rhythm that matched the waltz being played. Around them, friends and neighbors smiled approvingly, the town having embraced their relationship with the wholehearted support that characterized frontier communities. As midnight approached, Mayor Collins called for attention, raising his glass in a toast. "To Kennewick may the new year bring prosperity and growth to our town and happiness to all within it." Glasses were raised in response, and as the clock struck 12, Lucas turned to Violet. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Yes." Her expression was expectant, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Not here," he murmured. "Will you come outside with me for a moment?" She nodded, and they slipped away from the celebration into the clear, cold night. Stars blazed overhead in the moonless sky, and their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Lucas led her to a bench beneath a bare, branched cottonwood, suddenly nervous despite the certainty in his heart. "Violet," he began, taking both her hands in his. "When you came to Kennewick, I was existing, not living, going through the motions of each day without really being present in any of them." She squeezed his hands encouragingly but remained silent, letting him find his way through the words. "You didn't just make me laugh again," he continued. "You helped me remember how to feel all of it, not just the grief I'd been clinging to, but joy and hope and love." Lucas reached into his pocket and withdrew the small box containing Mary's ring. "I won't ever forget Mary or the life we built together. But I've come to understand that honoring her memory doesn't mean refusing to embrace a new future." He opened the box, the diamond catching the starlight. "Violet Graves, I love you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Violet's eyes shimmered with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "With all my heart, yes." Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger where it settled as if it had always belonged there. Then he drew her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise he felt for their future together. When they finally returned to the celebration, hand in hand, they were met with knowing smiles and immediate congratulations, news of their engagement spreading through the hall with the speed only a small town can achieve. Caleb embraced them both, his happiness for his father evident in his beaming face. "To new beginnings," he proposed, raising his glass. "And treasured memories," Violet added, her fingers intertwined with Lucas's. "To family," Lucas concluded, looking around at the community that had supported him through his darkest days and now celebrated his return to light. Past, present, and future. Spring came early to Kennewick in 1882, bringing with it renewal in more ways than one. March saw the arrival of Sarah's daughter, Mary Violet Porter Williams, a healthy, strong, lunged infant, who immediately captured her grandfather's heart. Lucas and Violet traveled to Denver for the christening, returning with countless stories of the baby's perfection and a newfound excitement about their approaching wedding. April brought the reopening of the expanded school, with Violet taking her place as teacher to the older students. She thrived in the role, her natural authority and genuine interest in her pupils quickly earning the respect of both children and parents. Lucas found himself proudly listening to accounts of her innovative teaching methods, often discussed animatedly at community gatherings. In late May, on a perfect spring day with wildflowers dotting the hillsides, Lucas Porter and Violet Graves were married in a simple ceremony at the church, where they had sheltered together during the flood. The entire town turned out to witness their union, the celebration afterwards spilling from the Dusty Creek saloon into the street as music and laughter filled the air well into the night. "Mrs. Porter," Lucas said softly as they finally made their way home to the house he had built for Mary, but which now held new memories alongside the old. "Are you happy?" Violet's answer was in her kiss, tender and passionate, full of promise and belonging. Their life together unfolded with the natural rhythm of seasons. Violet continued teaching while helping Lucas run the saloon, their complementary strengths creating a partnership that extended beyond their personal relationship. Under their joint management, the Dusty Creek evolved from a simple drinking establishment to a community gathering place, hosting literary discussions, musical evenings, and even educational talks for those seeking to improve their knowledge. The following spring brought news that Caleb had been accepted to study veterinary medicine in Philadelphia, an opportunity made possible in part by the saloon's increased profits under Violet's meticulous bookkeeping. Though sad to see him go, Lucas felt profound pride in his son's achievements and gratitude for Violet's encouragement of the young man's ambitions. "He'll come back," Violet assured Lucas as they waved goodbye to the eastbound train. "This is home for him." "Thanks to you in large part," Lucas replied, his arm around her waist. "You've made it a home again, not just a place of memories." That summer, as they celebrated their first anniversary with a private picnic by the creek, Violet shared news that completed their happiness. She was expecting a child, due in early winter. "Are you certain?" Lucas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "At our age." "Quite certain," she laughed, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Dr. Bennett confirmed it yesterday. It seems life has one more surprise in store for us." Lucas gathered her close, overwhelmed by the gift they had been given. "I never thought. After Emma, I couldn't bear to hope." "I know," Violet said softly, understanding as always. "Neither could I after Henry, but here we are, given another chance." Their son was born on a snowy December night, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his strong presence to the world. They named him Daniel Lucas Porter, honoring both their pasts while celebrating their shared future. "He has your eyes," Violet murmured, watching as Lucas cradled the infant with practiced hands that quickly remembered the long-ago skill. "And your determined chin," Lucas replied, marveling at the perfect blend of them both in this new life. As the years passed, their family grew and changed. Caleb returned from Philadelphia as predicted, establishing a veterinary practice in Kennewick and eventually marrying Josephine Miller, whose sick horse had first drawn him to her family's ranch. Sarah and James brought little Mary for regular visits, adding a brother, William, to their family in 1884. Daniel grew into a curious, thoughtful boy who combined his mother's intelligence with his father's practical nature. On his 5th birthday, Lucas began teaching him woodworking, the same age he had started teaching Caleb. "You're good with him," Violet observed one evening, watching them work together on a simple birdhouse. "Patient." "I've learned from the best," Lucas replied, glancing up at her with the smile that, even after years together, still made her heart quicken. "Besides, I have more reason to be patient these days, more joy in the passing of time." In the summer of 1888, as Kennewick celebrated the completion of its new town hall, Lucas found himself reflecting on the decade that had passed since Violet first walked into the Dusty Creek. Standing on the porch of their home, watching her tend to the garden with 7-year-old Daniel helping in his enthusiastic way, Lucas felt a contentment he would once have thought impossible after Mary's death. Grief still visited occasionally on birthdays, anniversaries, or when something unexpectedly triggered memories of what had been lost. But these moments no longer overwhelmed him, nor did they diminish the happiness he had found in his new life. Instead, they had become integrated into the fabric of his existence, threads of a different color in a tapestry that remained beautiful and complete. Violet looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled that particular smile she reserved only for him, full of understanding and love. She said something to Daniel, who nodded and continued his determined if somewhat haphazard weeding, then crossed the yard to join Lucas on the porch. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Porter," she said, slipping her arm through his. "Just counting my blessings, Mrs. Porter," he replied, covering her hand with his own, and finding them too numerous to finish before dinner. She laughed that warm, rich sound that had first breached the walls around his heart. "A fortunate dilemma, indeed." He drew her closer. "Thank you." "For what?" for walking into my saloon that day, for seeing something in me worth your time, for building this life with me." Violet rested her head against his shoulder, watching their son in the golden afternoon light. "Thank you for letting me," she said simply. As the sun began its descent toward the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Lucas Porter held his wife close and gave silent thanks for second chances, for the courage to embrace life after loss, and for the stranger who had walked in and made him laugh again, bringing with her a love he had never thought to find twice in one lifetime.